Okay, today we've got Jason Snell from the Six Colors website. Um, and it's great to have Jason. He's been around in the Apple culture a long time. He was lead editor for Macworld for more than a decade some time ago. And he actually has founded Six Colors along with Dan Morin, who we've also had as a speaker before. So today, Jason is going to talk to us about the latest goings on at Apple. So, Jason, if you've got your audio turned on.
Yep. Hi, everybody. I thank you for having me. It's early here in California, but on a Saturday morning. But you know what? I needed to be awake today, so why not now? I'm gonna also timing. Speaking of timing, Apple has an event on Tuesday. So I was actually hoping that this event would happen right before I came to you to talk about it, but instead it's in the future. So I'm going to do a little speculation about that. One of the topics that I often bring to a user group is this thing that I generically call the Apple status report. And it's sort of like where we are and then where Apple is going from here, because I think everybody is always wondering like what's next from Apple, what's going to be released. And we are, this is perfect in a way for that, because we're about to enter the big product release period every year in Apple world, which is September, October, November, and their holiday quarter, and they do the iPhone, and they're going to be new Macs and all sorts of other stuff that they like to release right before Christmas. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. If there are questions, I'm happy to stick around at the end for questions. If you've got something that you want to ask in the meantime, let me know. But otherwise, I'm happy to have plenty of time at the end if you've got questions about anything to throw in there. And I don't have any slides because I used to spend a lot of time on slides and then share them in a little Zoom window. And I decided that it would be better for me to not bother with that. And I could just say the words that I was going to say anyway, and not spend time on slides that were literally one or two words of what I was saying at the time. So it's just me in my garage talking to you. And yeah, just as a little bit of background, I worked at Mac User starting in 1993. And in 97, Mac User and Macworld merged together. And then I worked at Macworld from 1997 through 2014, I want to say now. It has been, it's funny to be introduced as being like, Jason was the lead editor at Macworld for a decade, but that was a long time ago, because it kind of is now. It's been, this is literally, I think it is the 7th anniversary of my departure from the big corporation and arriving instead here at in my garage. Right. So thank you. I do my own website. I do my own podcasts and stuff now, and I still write a column pretty much every week at Macworld. So they haven't completely lost sight of me. I still am connected to them, which is nice, because I've been connected with that site and magazine and everything since 97. A long time now. Okay, so where are we in terms of Apple status? If we think about 2021, obviously we now have had 2 waves of M1 Macs using Apple's own processors last fall. Been almost a year now. It's hard to believe. The Mac Mini, MacBook Air, and that low-end 13-inch MacBook Pro came out. And then this spring, we got the 24-inch iMac, the M1 iMac. This probably doesn't even bear repeating, but I'll just say it. These are all great computers. I heartily recommend them, unless you've got a very specific issue that precludes you from buying an M1, like you need lots and lots of monitors, or lots and lots and lots of ports, or are using very high-end apps, or need to emulate Windows. I mean, there's a very limited cross-section of things. But just for regular people, it's actually been a sigh of relief this last 10, 11 months to be able to say I have a clear recommendation for most people in terms of buying a Mac, because the M1s are good. They really are. I have a MacBook Air M1. It's amazing. Really, really good. And Apple also released an iPad Pro with an M1 processor in it, which is also really interesting and a perfectly good product, although it's a bit expensive. And the iPad Air is still there for people who want basically an iPad Pro for a little less money. So, all right, that's the past. Let's talk about the future. Tuesday, it's not that far in the future now. Tuesday, we're going to get some product announcements from Apple. Almost certainly a new iPhone, probably called the iPhone 13. Everybody who is afraid of the number 13 may be in for a tough one. The rumors all point to the idea that Apple is essentially going to replay what they did last year. So 4 models, if you remember, a mini, so 13 mini, 13, 13 Pro, and 13 Pro Max is probably what's going to happen again. The real question is always, now that Apple has Pro iPhones and non-Pro iPhones, and I really like the non-Pro iPhone. I have been using an iPhone 12 mini for most of the last year. By choice, I love it. And I think that the non-Pro ones have been, they look great. And the Pro ones, I actually like the look a little bit less in the iPhone 12. So we'll see what they do with the look of the 13. But I suspect one of the stories from Tuesday is going to be Apple trying to differentiate the 2 iPhone lines way more than they have in the past. And so if you think about something like, one of the rumors is a ProMotion display. And if you've used an iPad that's got the ProMotion display on it, that's 120 hertz refresh rate. It is a really nice feature. It's sort of smooth scrolling. It's a variable frame rate display. It actually opens up a lot of other possibilities for the iPhone, including potentially having an always on mode, kind of like the Apple Watch, where because the iPhone uses an OLED display technology, every pixel that lights up is generating power, is using power. But all the other pixels that are dark are not. So it's a very different than like an LED backlit display where you've got to turn the backlights on and they use a lot of power and they'll eat your battery up. And so when Apple does the Apple Watch with the always on display, what they're doing is it's an OLED display and it's a variable refresh display. So they can crank it down to basically like a frame per second and save huge amounts of power. And even in that little watch battery, they can keep the face of the watch on all day. So you put those 2 things together, and I really suspect, I don't know for sure, that what we're going to see on Tuesday is one or both of those features in probably just the Pro models, and that'll give everybody a reason to give Apple even more of their money for a Pro iPhone. But I really like the idea. The ProMotion display is beautiful. Smooth scrolling, variable frame rate means that it can adjust to movie content at 24 frames per second. It'll do it at 24. And when you're just staring at your apps trying to think about what to launch next, you will it can be at 1 frame per second while you're waiting, and then the moment you start to swipe, it cranks up the frame rate. So they can actually save a lot of power with an approach like this. Plus you get that always on, the idea that if your phone's laying on the table, it can display the time. It might be able to display some notifications. I have a theory. I'm going to talk about features of iOS 15 in a minute, because that's going to also probably release next week, if not the week after. iOS 15 has this feature called Focus that lets you sort of choose what you want to see. It's like a super customizable do not disturb. And one part of Focus is this idea of time-sensitive notifications and sort of choosing when notifications come into your face when you're using iOS. And if you combine that with the idea of an always-on display, it gets a little more connected, like the idea that only certain notifications should probably pop up on that phone if it's just laying there face up, showing the time. What notifications get to be shown in that moment, and so Apple introducing a whole new notification program and process at the same time actually kind of makes sense. So I think that the display is going to be the star on Tuesday, along, of course, with the chip. Apple is very proud of the chips that it makes. We will almost certainly see the A15, probably Bionic. They seem to like that name, A15 processor. which I think, so this year we can say it very clearly. It's interesting, not just because it's going to be the processor in the iPhone, and every year Apple has done such a good job compared to its competition, most notably Qualcomm, in terms of chip design, that generally the fastest iPhone is faster than the fastest Android phone the day it's replaced by a faster iPhone. So like if you think about it, Apple's kind of lapped Qualcomm, where Apple's chips tend to be more than a year, more than a cycle faster than the fastest smartphone chips from Qualcomm. But it's not just that. The A15 processor will be the basis for the M2, presumably, processor that's in the next wave of Macs in 2022. So how this processor, all of whatever its features are and all the power Apple talks about, I would say if you're paying attention on Tuesday, keep in mind that Apple's not just laying the foundation for the iPhone and the iPad, but also the Mac when it introduces a new chip, because the M1 is essentially a powered up version of the A14. And there will be new Macs next year, and they will all be using a powered up version of the A15. So something else to think about for the future. Let's see. Okay. OS releases. The other big thing that happens in the fall is the operating systems that got announced in June. And everybody like me who writes about Apple stuff is like, oh, new operating systems in June. Except nobody gets them until September or October, right? If they choose to upgrade then. So we get all excited in June and write about it. And I firmly believe, and I learned this at Macworld, that if you write about an operating system in June that's coming out in October, everybody's response is, tell me about it in October or September. I don't want to know now. Does this affect my life now? And unless you're using the public beta or something like that, it doesn't. But we're about to get to the point where iOS 15 is going to release and it's going to get pushed out to everybody's iPhones. A note about that, Apple is going to be a little less aggressive about OS updates this year than they have in the past. They have introduced a new system that allows you to, it more explicitly says, do you want to update to 15 or do you want to stay on 14? And if you think about it, it used to be, you could opt not to update, but Apple would keep pressuring you because to get security updates and stuff like that, be like, oh, you really should update because we have these security updates. And Apple's sort of changed their approach, and now they're going to have this sort of forked approach where you can stay on the previous version, at least for a while, and it will continue to give you security updates. Separate from the path where you update to iOS 15. Now, I've been using iOS 15 all summer, and I think it's fine. I haven't had any major problems with it, but I like the idea that Apple is no longer kind of going to use device security as a prod to get everybody to update to the next version. They're going to give everybody a little bit of time to stay back and still get their updates. So you may notice your software update this fall looks a little bit different. And that's why. I think the big overarching story about iOS 15 and iPadOS 15 and also macOS Monterey, which my guess is going to come later in sort of mid to late October. There's probably going to be another Apple event in October that introduces some new Macs, and they'll probably introduce Monterey then. macOS is tended to ship later than iOS. That will probably continue. In fact, if you look at their releases of betas, it seems as an outside observer that they literally stopped working on the Mac for a little while in order to finish up iOS. The Mac beta sort of ceased for a while and now are going to come back. So Monterey is coming, but it's probably not coming until late October. I think the overarching story of these releases is that it feels like Apple has spent, if not a decade, like at least 5 years, maybe, 5-7 years, really trying to figure out how to get its operating systems to work together. For many years, any longtime Mac user will probably have this feeling that the Mac was sort of an afterthought for many years in Apple's OS announcements. They would roll out these new features to the iPad and the iPhone, and they'd be like, well, it's not on the Mac, or it's kind of on the Mac, but not really, only a little bit, or a couple years later, it shows up on the Mac. And Apple has spent the last few years kind of aligning all of the fundamentals of its operating systems together. If you think about it, OS 10 was the basis for the iPhone OS in 2007. So they took OS 10 and they put it on the iPhone and they started to modify it. And then the iPhone evolved from there. And about 3 or 4 years ago, Apple looked at iOS and macOS and realized that even though they were based on the same operating system fundamentally, they had drifted so far apart. So they spent the last few years trying to align them underneath to be more alike. And this is what enabled Catalyst, which is that technology that lets lets developers sort of lightly modify their iPad apps and they run on the Mac. It is what enables M1 Macs to run iPhone and iPad apps, or I guess technically it's iPad apps unmodified on M1 Macs. I think it really enables M1 Macs fundamentally, that they really wanted if they're going to all run the same chip, they all need to run the same operating system underneath the foundational layer of the operating system. But the other result of that is that macOS features and iOS features all now kind of come together. And so when you look at the new features Apple is introducing this fall, they are across all the platforms. There's new FaceTime features, there's new features in Messages, there's new stuff in Safari, there's new stuff in Notes, there's the focus mode that I mentioned, which is like custom do not disturb for all the contexts you want to set up. There are some new Maps features, there are new features in Photos. There's a new translation feature that's in line where you can basically click on some text and say, translate this for me. It's very cool. Support for spatial audio. There's new dictation stuff. There's a new version of Shortcuts that also runs on the Mac. All of these things are on the Mac this fall and on iOS this fall. And so I feel like we've exited the era where the Mac is sort of an afterthought for Apple's strategy. Now Apple really does want to drop all of its new stuff on all the platforms, even though the Mac is going to be, a month later than the iOS release. The fact is that they're not introducing new features and saying, we don't know if the Mac will ever get this feature. They're not doing that anymore. And that's a good thing. The thing you'll notice the most is Safari. Safari is different on all of the platforms. When they introduced this feature in June, it was very controversial. A lot of us looked at what they were showing and said, this doesn't make sense. It's hard to read the tabs. On the iPhone, they put this sort of floating thing at the bottom of the screen that you use to control Safari. They got a lot of feedback, and to Apple's credit, they say they do betas in the summer because they want feedback. Sometimes it feels like they don't actually. They want bug reports, but they don't want feedback saying, we think you made a mistake, and they're not looking for it and they don't want to hear it. To their credit, they heard it and they reacted, and the Safari design that's going to ship in a week or two is way better than it was at the beginning of the summer. It's much more usable. There is a huge change, which is that address bar is now at the bottom of the screen on the iPhone. And the idea there is they make big phones. You're holding your phone. You can't reach up to the top of the address bar. You can't do kind of a one-handed thing. It's harder to get up to the top of the screen than it is to access the bottom. And they put a really fun, I think, good gesture on the address bar at the bottom, which is if you swipe on the address bar left or right, you'll go to the next tab that's open. Because, there are tabs on Mac and iPad, but on iPhone, the tab interface is sort of invisible. And so now you can sort of swipe between tabs, which is, I think, pretty clever. And if you hate it, I think if you tap and hold on the address bar at the bottom of the screen, there's an item right there that says, put this at the top of the screen, please, right? Just go back to the way it is. So I understand that it's probably going to be too much for some people, although I'm kind of getting used to it down there. I think it's okay. And they introduced this feature called tab groups, which I think is actually really great. If you're somebody who uses lots of tabs, they've created this feature inside Safari called tab groups, where you can create as many groups as you want and put tabs in them and then switch between them. So instead of having 50 tabs open in your browser, and I know people who do that, or 2 windows with 25 tabs and 25 tabs, you can have these tab groups. Each group can have whatever, 25 tabs, 10 here, 15 there, 25 over there, and you can switch among them, and they all sync via iCloud, so they all appear on all of your devices. And they're not bookmarks, they're open tabs. So if you close a tab, it closes everywhere. If you go to a different page or add another page into that tab group, while it's open everywhere. And then when you close it, it goes away. It takes a little getting used to. And I think it's really weird that all Safari browsers have a mode that is not a tab group, that's like the old way it works. I don't know why that isn't also a tab group and doesn't also sync, at least optionally. So you often, I find that I'm in not a tab group, and then I'm like, well, wait a second, I want to save this. Why is this not in a tab group? And I have to add it to a tab group. But I think it's a really clever feature for people who like to use tabs, and that it will actually be very popular. And they're also adding, the other big feature that they're adding to Safari, but not yet, is something called iCloud Private Relay. If you pay for iCloud storage, you will also get access to this feature that basically encrypts your web traffic and hides its origin, so people on web servers cannot identify you as clearly, which is a nice feature, but it was kind of buggy in the summer, and Apple announced that they're not going to, or they're going to release it as a beta, which really what that means is it doesn't quite work right, and it's going to ship in the operating system turned off. And if people want to try it out, they can turn it on, but Apple's not going to turn it on yet because it doesn't work quite right, which I think, again, it shows some maturity on Apple's part, that they're not going to inflict a feature that they know doesn't work right on people on day one. So that's what's going on. I think Safari is probably the biggest thing. I do want to mention a couple other things that are happening in the OS updates this fall. Mac users who rely on Automator, the good news is Automator and AppleScript are still completely functional in Monterey. I would say better news is that Apple has actually done something with automation on the Mac for the first time in ages, which is they brought shortcuts from iOS to the Mac. It's a work in progress. Some stuff works perfectly brought over from iOS to the Mac, and other stuff doesn't work right. And Apple has admitted this is a multi-year transition. But what's exciting is that Apple actually seems to think that making little automated scripts and using them on the Mac is worth their time, which there was about 10 years where I saw no evidence that Apple cared. And I am somebody who uses little automator actions in the Finder, and I use Keyboard Maestro, and I use all of these different things, and I use shortcuts on iPad. So they're getting there. They're adding shortcuts in, but it's on the side. It is something you can experiment with if you want to. And if you have somebody set up an automator action for you 5 years ago that does a thing, that'll all still work because they're not ripping any of that stuff out. They're aware that it's not all they're not ready to replace it yet. They will replace it someday. They're trying very hard to make it so that automator actions will just work in shortcuts. They don't quite work right yet, but they will, hopefully, in a future version. As an iPad user, I want to say they made a bunch of multitasking improvements in iPad OS 15 that I think are really great. They added this little 3-dot icon at the top of each window that you can tap to send it into sort of different modes. It also grays out when it's not if you've got two windows open, two panes, two apps on an iPad, the one that's active, the little dots are white, and the one that's not active, they're grayed out a little bit, which is they're really on the verge of realizing that they could do actual windows on the Mac. But they don't. Oh, we're screen sharing. Somebody's screen sharing their screen now.
Shirley, that's you. Looks like you're sharing your screen.
Yeah.
Turn that off.
Yeah, hit escape, Shirley. On the keyboard, hit escape.
Hey, there we go. All right. So I feel like Apple's very slowly taking the iPad to a place where multiple windows, that they're building a foundation for doing more intelligent and more Mac-like multitasking in a way that I think is going to be good for the iPad. They added a bunch of keyboard shortcuts. If you use a keyboard with an iPad, the globe key, which is sort of like Apple basically added a new key that it uses for global keyboard shortcuts on the iPad. It sure feels like they're laying the groundwork to do something. I suspect they're laying the groundwork to actually do something where if you plug an iPad into a big screen, it actually will put up windows and look kind of like a Mac. But that's not yet. But there's a bunch of improvements on the iPad that I think are nice. They added the app library from the iPhone. It's in iPad OS 15. You can put widgets anywhere on the home screen on the iPad now, which you couldn't do in iPad OS 14. They had to go in like a little left-hand column. Okay, some other, just while I'm wrapping up the OS stuff that you're going to be seeing. FaceTime, some changes there to make it a little more Zoom-like. You can send invites to people like for a FaceTime conversation. They're going to have FaceTime for the web. So people on devices that don't have FaceTime can be in your FaceTime calls. That focus mode that I mentioned, where you can do custom do not disturb essentially modes. So if you say, well, I'm focusing on this, I'm working, I only want to hear from people I work with. Or I'm not working, I only want to hear from my friends and family. You can set up all sorts of modes to do that, and they sync across all your devices. So if you go in focus mode on your iPhone, it also puts your iPad or your Mac in focus mode as well. And that can be until you turn it off, or it can be like do not disturb until an hour from now, or until the end of the meeting that's currently on your calendar, or however you want to define it, which I think is pretty smart expansion of do not disturb. Photos, the Photos app is near and dear to my heart. I read a book for Take Control ebooks about the Photos app, so I spent a lot of time with it. Often I have people saying to me, why doesn't Photos do this? And what is Apple doing with Photos? I was like, look, I don't know. I just have to write about what they do with it. I have to try to figure out what's new with it and what they're doing. And there are a bunch of little improvements there in the Photos app. I think one of the most fun ones is that the Photos app is going to recognize a whole lot more objects in your photos. So for a few years now, the Photos app does billions of calculations on every photo in your photo library on device to analyze it so that you can search for like zebras, and it'll be like, here are pictures of zebras, or dogs, and here are pictures of dogs. They've added a whole bunch of other stuff there. The one that I thought was the kind of most amazing example of this is my family and I went to London a few years ago, and I have some shots of random buildings in London that you can actually click on in Photos, and it tells you what the building is. And we went to the Tate Modern, and I have a picture of my daughter in front of a painting, and you can literally click on it and say, what painting is this? And it recognizes the paint, partially obscured by my daughter, painting, and says, that's this painting, with a web link to read about it. And, it'll identify some plants. It tries to identify animal breeds. That is dumb. I have to say, yes, if you show it a German Shepherd, it'll say that's a German Shepherd. But every picture of a cat that I showed to it, if the cat's tail is curled under, it says, oh, it's a Manx. It's a tailless cat. And it's like, no, it's just a cat with its tail hidden. That one's kind of dumb. But the artwork, book covers, movie posters, buildings, other landmarks, it figures that stuff out. It's pretty cool. And then there's live text, which is system-wide. It's not just in Photos, but basically system-wide, starting in iOS 15 and macOS Monterey, every bit of text in any photo that you've got is selectable. It just automatically scans and turns it into text that you can click on or tap on if you're on iOS, and select it and copy it as if it were plain text, even though it's in an image. And this goes for screenshots, but it also goes for signs, like in the middle, like you've got a picture of a sign, you can copy the text off the sign. T-shirts with things written on them, you can copy the text off of it. It's pretty remarkable, and that's everywhere, except ironically in the search box in the Photos app, which won't search for text, but Spotlight will. So if you wanted to search your entire photo library, I did this. So I'm a San Francisco Giants fan, and I searched for Giants in Spotlight, and it brought up like every picture that has a Giants t-shirt on it, the sign at the ballpark, a screenshot of a ticket that was in my wallet. It's amazing. I when I searched for zebra, which I use as an example sometimes, I found that I had taken pictures in London on that same trip of a sign that said zebra crossing, which is like a crosswalk. And it said, well, you could be looking for zebras, or you could be looking for the word zebra in all of your photos. It's live text is pretty remarkable. And it's a very cool thing to see and to play with. And then shared with you is the last thing I want to talk about, I think, about this, which is throughout the system, Apple is trying to interconnect a bunch of stuff with messages. So like if people share links with you, there's a little section in the Safari homepage that will show those links. And you can turn it off or on, but it's a smart idea. Like when somebody sends you a link and then you think, oh, who sent me that link? And you have to go to messages and you have to try to find it and see who sent it to you. Or with macOS Monterey and iOS 15, you can open Safari and down at the bottom, it'll be shared with you. And they'll be like, these are the links that were shared with you lately, which depending on the context, I think is kind of brilliant. It also does this in a few other places, including like if somebody sends you an Apple TV link, the TV app will say, this is the movie or TV show that they shared with you, and photos. And it's actually, first off, if you use photos, the Messages app has every photo that somebody sends you has a little icon next to it that you can just click on and it immediately adds that photo to your photos library. There's no right click, download, open photos, drag it in. No, you just go boop and that's it. It goes in your photos library. It's super convenient. And Photos also does this other thing that's a little bit weird, but in the spirit of shared with you, also in the Photos app, it'll show you all the photos that have been shared with you in Messages. So if you are wondering what that photo was that you're looking for and you don't want to look through all those messages, you can look at the Photos app and it's going to say, here are all the photos that were shared with you. But the weird thing that it does is if it sees you in the photo, or if it looks at the location and the timestamp and knows, and this is the wild one, knows that you were there when that photo was taken, which I believe it's doing because it's looking at your photos library and seeing if you also have photos that were taken during that time at that location. If it knows that, or it sees you in the photo, that photo just appears in your photos library, which is very weird. It's even weirder. It's not actually in your photos library. There's a little message bubble. It's like the messages icon in the bottom corner that says, this is also a photo that you can see here, but it's not technically in your library until you add it. Very strange. I get what they're trying to do there, but it is a little disconcerting to have photos that I didn't take appear in my library. But what Apple insists is that it will only do that if it sees you in the photo, or it knows you were there somehow. So anyway, there's a lot of stuff. I've been using the betas all summer. I think iOS 15 and iPadOS 15 are in pretty decent shape. macOS Monterey isn't, but they got time. It's more than a month before that's going to come out. I think ultimately macOS Monterey is pretty usable. I think they made all of the difficult changes in Catalina and Big Sur. And so if you're using Catalina and Big Sur, Monterey is not going to be too jarring. If you're still back on macOS Mojave, that's a huge kind of leap to go from there. I still have a Mac here at my office that just runs macOS Mojave because I want to be able to run old software that doesn't run anymore on Catalina and Big Sur or Monterey. So that brings us to the future. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is where we go from here for the Mac, especially the Apple Silicon Macs. So we're coming up on a year of Apple Silicon Macs shipping. What's next? Now, I think the easiest way to approach this is to say, well, what haven't they updated yet? So what's next is going to be almost certainly next month at this point, the MacBook Pro. The two high-end MacBook Pros didn't get updated. They're still available for Intel. That's the 16 and the high-end 13. The rumor is that the high-end 13 is going to become a 14-inch MacBook Pro, and that they're going to update the 16-inch, and they're going to update them both with a new chip, because as much as I love the M1, it's limited in what it can do. It's not a high-end Pro product chip. It's just not. And this gets into a really interesting bit of guessing because we haven't seen Apple's approach for more advanced versions of their chips. Like the M1 is as advanced as it's gotten, and it's not quite enough for high-end MacBook Pro. So sounds like probably what it's going to be is a variation of the M1 with more processor cores and more capabilities. My guess is they'll call it something like the M1X, but we don't know for sure. I don't think it's going to be the M2 because I think the M2 is going to be based on that A15 that is introduced next week with the new iPhone, and that we'll see those next year. But I do think that we'll see something with more cores that will be more appealing to people who want a much more powerful MacBook Pro. And then the other rumor is that they will also potentially have the mini LED display. And if you've not seen an M1 iPad Pro, which has that mini LED display, it's beautiful. It's a high dynamic range display. You watch a movie, for example, on one, and it is stunning how bright the white parts of the screen get and how dark the black parts of the screen are. It's a beautiful display. So to have that on a MacBook Pro would be very impressive with all that extra dynamic range. It would be a really beautiful display. And it probably will not be cheap, but it's the high-end MacBook Pro. So I think that that's probably appropriate. And there are rumors that there will also probably be a high-end Mac Mini. It's kind of gone beyond a lot of people's notice that when Apple replaced the Mac Mini, Intel Mac Mini with the M1 Mac Mini, they didn't actually replace the Intel Mac Mini. The Intel Mac Mini is still for sale in its space gray professional Intel version, as well as its silver M1 version. And that says to me that Apple realizes that some Mac Mini people also want power that is maybe not available in the M1. So I would not be surprised at all if we see a fancy M1X or whatever Mac Mini, maybe in space gray. And then the big one for me, because I really would love to buy it, is I feel like it's going to be until next year sometime, next spring maybe, before we get a replacement for the 27-inch iMac. I think the 24-inch M1 iMac is amazing. It really is a fantastic computer. But I have an iMac Pro, and I do use the 8 Xeon cores to do audio editing and video editing and stuff that the M1 is not quite. The M1, I've got an M1 iMac over here that I'm using for macOS Monterey, and it's good. But then I try some of the stuff that I do with my iPad Pro, the higher end kind of stuff, and the iPad Pro, or the iMac Pro, it's still better. It's just still better because it's so much more powerful. So I want that new big Apple Silicon iMac, but it's not going to happen this year. Almost certainly. It's going to be on the horizon for next year. The Mac Pro is still sitting out there. Nobody knows what Apple's going to do with the Mac Pro and how they're going to do it. Like, let's see how they handle the MacBook Pro first before we start talking about the Mac Pro. And I think we'll probably see a revision to the MacBook Airs. There's rumors out there that the MacBook Air will get a new version with Apple Silicon, of course, again, but that's the M2. And that they might actually have colors like the iMac does, which I would love to buy a blue MacBook Air. I think that would be, or orange. I think that would be a lot of fun. Take your pick, see how they match, see if they match your favorite football team or baseball team. And that's what I do anyway. It's like I've got some very narrow constraints. I'm not allowed certain colors. Other colors I'm allowed. That's just how it works if you're a sports fan. So I think those will come too, and I'm looking forward to those as well. So that is the reset going into the event on Tuesday. New iPhones, new Apple Watch, probably not, may look a little different, but probably not a dramatic Apple Watch update beyond that. And the release of iOS and iPadOS, which will be a big deal because unless you've been using the beta, it's finally your chance to try out some of these features like the ones that I talked about. And that's been a pretty good summer. Those features are pretty good. And the ones that didn't work well, Apple's not shipping the ones that were not working right. Apple has shown a lot of discipline in saying, we've got a few features that we need to work on a little bit more. And so they won't be in there when they ship. And then beyond that, I think definitely a Mac event probably in October. And we're going to see, if you've been holding out for a MacBook Pro with a more powerful processor than the M1, I think you're probably going to be happy at last in October. So that's my Apple status report. If anybody has questions about anything, really, I have the fortunate job that I get to do this stuff all day. I've said since I started in the 90s, they pay me to play with computers all day. It's a great job. I'm happy to do it, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about anything.
Jason, question about the change in, I guess, the form factor of the new MacBook Pro.
Just, is there a change?
Yeah.
It sounds to me like the 16, they already redesigned the 16-inch back on Intel, and it sounds like they're probably keeping that fairly similar, and then doing to the 13-inch what they did to the 15 to 16 transition, taking a 13-inch and making it smaller bezels and so you can fit a 14-inch diagonal display on it. It's unclear if they're making more kind of like flat side design language kind of stuff like they did with the iMac. It's possible. The big change is probably the touch bar. I think all signs are pointing to the touch bar just being removed, which there are some people who love the touch bar, but it seems to mostly have been greeted with a combination of not interested or not liking. And so I think it's going to go away. But I think they'll be recognizably MacBook Pros. I just think that my guess is they did all that work for the 16, that the 16 will probably look pretty similar and the 14 will look a lot like the 16, but a 14-inch. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
I got a statement more so than a question.
Great.
I was watching the news yesterday about the lawsuit, and just wanted to say, yesterday I switched from Norton, which does it, to Evernote, and not Norton, but Notions to Evernote.
Mm-hmm.
It was so nice to be able to use my Apple Card to buy it, the subscription, add my subscription into the list of all the subscriptions where they're all in one place. So what everybody says they lost seems like the convenience that Apple has, everything in one place, I can leak out of it and put it in, will be just too good of a feature for them to really lose anything. Do you agree?
I do. So for those who don't know, Apple's been going through all sorts of things with regulators and lawsuits about various aspects of the App Store business. And yesterday there was a case that Apple basically won the Epic Games case, saying that Apple was a monopolist and they had monopolized the iPhone games payment market. And the judge said, no, it's the games payment market and Apple only owns a slice of that. And that Apple's not a monopolist just because they're good at their jobs. But she did say that Apple needs to allow app developers to link out to alternate payment systems. And it's none of us are really sure what exactly that means. And it'll be up to the judge, because the judge enforces that ruling. She's going to decide. But I think what you're getting at, and I think that this gets missed sometimes, is that Apple probably is going to mandate and will be allowed to mandate that external payment systems be in addition to in-app purchases. And the fact that Apple's in-app purchase system is good. And the reason that developers mostly don't want to use it is because they take 30%. So I think what's going to happen is that Apple is going to be forced to compete. But you're absolutely right. There are lots of things about Apple's system that are very good. And a lot of developers I've talked to have said, I don't mind the 30% because the system is so good and it works for me. There are other developers who feel like that 30% is just too much and they can't do it. Or in some cases, for things like if you're doing ebooks or something like that, you can't take the 30% hit. There's nothing left after you do that, and you can't stay in business, or almost nothing left. So yeah, I think in the end, Apple's system does have a lot going for it. And if they're motivated to compete by this judge's order, that maybe they'll be even more competitive. And I do think the net result is going to be Apple will lose a little bit of money, But what Apple will probably do is compete. They'll reduce their cut. They'll do a bunch of things to make it so that users will get to choose. And I think a lot of users will choose to use Apple's payment systems because there's a lot of convenience there. But it's so early that we don't really know. But I think I get what you're saying, that there's a lot to be said for using Apple's in-app purchase systems. I think the challenge right now is there's no alternative, and some app developers don't like that. But I think the people who look at that ruling and say, oh, well, that's it for Apple's in-app purchases, everything's just going to be an external purchase. I think that's not going to be the case. And I think Apple's going to be competitive about it when forced to be. And their system is pretty good. Like, that's why the App Store has been so successful, is that you've got the credit card on file and you do a couple of taps and then you bought something. And that's going to be harder to do with an external payment system that's linked to from like a web page.
Hey, can I ask a question?
Great.
Okay. Jason, I've been a long-time reader of your content, and if I remember right, I think you used to do a bunch of video stuff with Leo Laporte too.
Yeah.
So
I'm still on.
love
I'm
your
about
stuff.
half an hour from Leo's studio, so I still drive up there when they need me.
So I love that you're with us today, and thank you for doing that.
Thanks.
Quick question. I love my my M1 MacBook Air, and I've been, I kind of went from the MacBook Pro to the MacBook Air with the M1 chip, and I've been real happy with it. With one exception, I do occasionally need to access some Windows applications. So in the past, I've run Boot Camp or Parallels. I have the experimental Parallels with the ARM beta thing from the Windows preview. Is there any hope that we're going to get some sort of solution that's more consumer friendly in the future? Have you seen anything or heard anything about something coming out like that?
Yeah. Okay. That's a good one. I do think that there's hope in the long run for Windows on Apple Silicon. Because I think Apple and Microsoft are actually motivated to make it work. Whether it's, I don't know if Boot Camp will ever happen, but I think Microsoft embracing the idea that Apple Silicon Macs can also run the version of Windows that runs on ARM makes sense. And I think there was a statement by, was it by Apple? I get reading between the lines. It feels to me like, because somebody was saying the problem with it is that even if you run the Windows version of ARM, or the ARM version of Windows, they've got to emulate the apps, right? They emulate their Intel-based apps on ARM. But the beauty of it is that's on Microsoft to do. And I think it was like VMware said, we're not investigating doing Intel Windows emulation. Instead, we're investigating running virtualized Windows for ARM, and we'll let Microsoft figure out how to run those apps. And so, like, that's all going to happen. And having the operating system be native and then have the OS vendor do the very clever, sort of like how Apple does it with Rosetta, very clever kind of code translation for their Intel apps, is probably going to be a way forward that will probably be usable. But I want to say the other thing, it depends on your context here, but like, even Microsoft is now moving to a model where you can pay them for a PC in the cloud, right? That is your PC, and you just connect to it over the internet, and you get it in a window, and it's like, browser window, and you've got a Windows PC. So if you're not like places where there's no connectivity, I feel like that's going to be a solution for a lot of Mac users, is whether it's Microsoft's system or some other company that offers you basically a screen into a PC somewhere that belongs to you. Getting PC on demand for a Mac user, I think, is going to be easier and easier over time. But I think it's going to take a couple years to shake out. But I am really of a belief that in a year or two, you'll be able to get Parallels or VMware. They will run an official licensed virtualized Windows for ARM with Microsoft's Intel translation of apps that will let you run non-ARM native apps on that version of Windows. So I think we'll get there. I think there's too many reasons. Like Microsoft Microsoft wants its stuff used everywhere, right? Like Microsoft is a very different company than they used to be. I think they want it to happen, and that the Apple's platform is one of the best places for their Windows on ARM to go.
Thank you.
So I'm optimistic. Thanks.
Hey, Jason.
Yeah.
My name is Tim Baker. I live in Fort Worth, and I have the privilege to have met you back in 2005. And I have a photo here from the archives, if I can share
Okay.
that.
All right. I'm gonna have a lot less gray hair. Where was this? Was this on the Mac cruise, or was this somewhere
Yeah,
else?
this was back on the.
Oh yeah.
So there's
With
Leo
Woz.
and
That's the
Chris.
Mexico cruise. Yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned Automator. There's
Sal. That's right. Derek Story is there, and yeah, that's a great group. And Woz's future wife, Janet, in the back row right next to me. They got married. I don't know if they met on this cruise or not, but they got married. That's pretty funny.
There's Andy.
That was that was a good time.
Yeah, it was.
That was a good time.
It was very good. Very good. I was excited that you were speaking today.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I wish we were still doing those cruises. Those were a lot of fun, and maybe something like that'll happen as the cruise industry comes back, because that was
Leo
great.
is having a cruise next summer, and I did sign up for that. So
he did mention that. Leo did mention that last time I was up there. I do a lot of filling in for Leo, so I only see Leo about half the time I go up there, but we're not quite neighbors, but we're very close since we're both up here in the North Bay.
I'm looking forward to his Alaskan cruise in July, I believe it is.
Yeah, we did one of those. The first MacMania cruise was in Alaska, and it was beautiful. That's a great cruise.
Well, it's wonderful to talk to you. Thank you for coming to visit our group.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm gonna reveal something really awkward now, which is my college football team is playing in Fort Worth today. So, I mean, good luck to TCU. They probably win, but go Bears is what I have to say to that. So that's why I have to have blue and not red in all my computers, is because red is Stanford. It's not allowed. Blue is Cal. Yellow also works. Red is not allowed in my house. Any other? Yes.
Quick story about the future of live text. I've been using Text Snipper.
Yeah.
And a lot of it, nearly everyone knows Mike Firth and Gigi in our club. Gigi is a blind person. She's an absolute marvel on the computer. She makes part of her income from proofing Braille text. And I talked about this a little bit the other day, and Mike says, Gigi there's one thing she cannot grab text from. And he sent me a screenshot of this thing that she can't get text from. I used Text Snipper on it. It just did perfectly. And then I've tried taking a screenshot of my desktop, and then Text Snipper grabs everything. It
does. It does, and that's not Text Snipers doesn't require like the latest version of the OS. So if you're not planning on updating to Monterey, there's an app that will do the exact same thing, and it's amazing, right? It's this technology is funny because like you've been able to search in images for a while in like PDFs and things, but they're not like searching what they do. Okay, so let's say you got a word, and the OCR, optical character recognition engine, doesn't know for sure what that word is. So what it does is it puts in the search index, it puts all of the possibilities for that word. Well, that makes it searchable. So searchable is relatively easy. But to copy it out, you've got to know what that word is. It's like a whole other layer of difficulty.
Yeah.
And it's amazing that it's great that Apple put it in the system and it'll be everywhere. But you're right. You can get Text Sniper and just do it today on any Mac. Right. And it's great. Like the accessibility stuff, the ability to make all text. I keep thinking about how like people post on Twitter and other social media. They post images because they want to have it be fancy with their own fonts and all that. And it removes all the readability of it because screen readers are based on reading the text. So it's not friendly for blind people at all. But like you put this new tech in on top of it and it fights that, and it wins it back, because now that text is readable again inside that image, and it unlocks it for people who would otherwise not be able to read it. Thank you for mentioning that. That's a great tool for people who are not going to be on Monterey. You can use Text Sniper. Any other questions, comments? I don't know if anybody out there is actually a TCU fan, but thank you. Thank you all. This was a lot of fun on a Saturday morning, and now I'm up. I'm awake.
All right. Awesome, Jason. Yeah, this was a great presentation. Thanks again.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you. I was right before the pandemic. I went to I went to the Rangers ballpark before it closed. I was there on a very nice, clear, hot summer day, and I understand why they wanted to cover put a roof on the new ballpark. I was like, oh, I see it now. It was very hot, but it was great. I hadn't been in Dallas in years before that, in the Dallas area, and it was a lot of fun. So thank you, Texas. I hope to be back there sometime soon.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
All right. Take care.